Welcome to the Christian Mysticism Podcast, where we explore the fascinating history of Christian mysticism from the early days of the church until today. I'm Alberto de la Cruz, and I'm joined by my co-host, Dr. Carlos Eyre, the T. Lawrence Riggs Professor of History and Religious Studies at Yale University. Well, happy February to you, Carlos.
Yeah, same to you, Alberto. Yes.
On our last episode, we tackled pain and suffering in mysticism, so we decided to lighten it up a little bit. With this episode. We're going to be talking about love and mercy. And before we get started, I want to remind all our listeners to please subscribe to our podcast on whatever platform you're listening to it. Give us a like, and that helps us a lot. So without further ado, take it away, Dr. Eyre.
Yeah, and when I suggested this theme last month, it didn't occur to me that it would be airing in the month of Valentine's Day. Very fitting. And as some mystics say, there are no such things as coincidences, right? Everything is planned. But in this case, yes, if there was a plan, it didn't come from me, and I consciously, maybe unconsciously. So yeah, love, what a theme. And it's, as all themes related to Christian mysticism, love has a wonderful dimension to it, but it also has a paradoxical dimension to it. It's deeply wrapped in paradoxes of all sorts, not the least of which is the central paradox of how can a human being come to love an invisible being, right? This is something that most Christian mystics talk about, the hard road it is to get to the point where you can actually love God. Because obviously, they all say, if you don't pray, how can you establish a relationship with the divine? So prayer is key, right? And so is self-denial. So lighthearted as the subject is, and joyful as it can be, it does include these very puzzling, not just paradoxes, but some might say, even if you view it from one perspective, you can see it as contradictions, because there's also in love and in ecstatic joy, to get there, you have to work really hard at it. But it is an essential component of Christian mysticism. Some might say it's the most essential component because it's the driving force as well as the ultimate goal. It's both simultaneously. And the goal is to not just know God, but to love God. And actually, that was the first question asked in the old catechism that was used by the American Catholic Church, the Baltimore Catechism. First question was, why did God make me? The answer was, so I could come to know him and love him. Tall order. But what a goal to have. And it's understood by mystics and theologians. Love is understood as an act of will. So it assumes that there is this component in the human being, the will, that makes choices. Because, how do we make choices? Now we understand, in our day and age, we understand that our thinking is generated by the brain, and that our choosing is probably also, located in a very specific part of the brain. But for centuries, Christian theologians understood human beings as composed of an intellect and a will, and that those two had to work in perfect unison if one were to become a good person, a holy person, or in the case of mystics, to have an ongoing loving relationship with the divine. So we tend to think in our day and age of love more as an emotion rather than an act of will. And it's true that even in the previous centuries, yes, it was understood that love is an emotion. But love is very, very closely tied to the will. And in Christian theology, over the centuries, it came to be just the unquestionable assumption that repeatedly training your will to make the right choices was the best way to come to love God. So if we distance ourselves from present-day understanding of emotions and consider how for centuries Christian mystics understood this love that one can experience with God and from God, and the love that one can have for God, closely tied to our choices, inseparable from our choices. Anyway, where did this come from in Christianity? How was Christianity able to incorporate this human emotion into religion? Well, a place to begin is the Bible. And the Bible is full of passages in which God is spoken of as an object of love. And more than that, in the Hebrew Scriptures, in the Old Testament, it's a commandment. You have to love God with all your heart, all your soul, all your strength, and all your mind. And this is in Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy 6, 1-9, that whole stretch of passages from 1-9. That's the commandment. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength. So how is that possible? How does anybody get there? How can you love this God with all your strength as well as your mind and soul? It's like your whole being. You're being asked to love this invisible deity with all of yourself. And that commandment rings time and time and time again throughout the Old Testament, and that it appears with a somewhat different emphasis in the New Testament, because in the New Testament you have Jesus, who is proclaimed to be the Son of God. So the love that you have, supposed to have for God, extends to this human person of the Trinity, Jesus, the Son of God. So the focus changes. No longer is it an invisible deity. You have someone who walked the earth, albeit not for very long. So the Old Testament is full of passages that refer to the love of God. The Psalms especially have many, many passages that speak of the love of God. And perhaps the most intense, and the one that many Christian mystics have focused on at great length, is Psalm 42, and especially the lines, "As a deer longs for flowing streams, so my soul longs for you, God. My soul thirsts for God, for the living God. When shall I come and behold the face of God?" If there's a mystical passage in the Psalms that has been of great significance for Christian mystics, it is this one. And since I don't know Hebrew, I don't know what the Hebrew original is and how translation I just read matches up, but it's very clear because I've read it in various European languages, and they all sound exactly the same, regardless of what words I use for, like, for instance, longing. The thirsty, yes, that's in every translation I have read. And face, that's also in every translation I have read. Longing is something we associate with emotion, right? And longing to see the face of God is something that is very close to a loving relationship between two humans when one is absent and you long to see them. It's something humans can understand. This is a passage that can also be turned into love poetry for love between two humans. You missed your loved one. You miss him or you miss her, and you want to see their face again. Then there's also the Song of Songs in the Old Testament, which is about the bride and the bridegroom. And who are the bride and the bridegroom? Well, Christian interpretations of the Song of Songs began to blossom very early on. And the Christian interpretation is that the bride is the human soul and the bridegroom is God. And of course, in the Christian context, the entire Trinity, but also the second person, Jesus, human manifestation of God. And boy, there's no other book of the entire Old Testament that had more commentaries written on it during the Middle Ages than the Song of Songs. And many mystics have written commentaries on them. One of them, not exactly a commentary, but we'll get to him soon enough, John of the Cross wrote the most beautiful love poetry based on the text of the songs of songs. Except in his case, the love poetry very explicitly directed at God. So it's inescapable in Christianity. And then you have a lot of passages, and we don't need to go through all of them in the New Testament. And actually that commandment from Deuteronomy is repeated in Luke chapter 10, verse 27. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, strength, and mind. And this is said when someone comes up to Jesus and asks him, what do I need to be saved? And this is the response. And then, of course, the following verse says, love your neighbor as yourself. And the entire law and the prophets, says Jesus, are wrapped up in this. Loving God, loving your neighbor as yourself.
I was thinking of this passage from Luke that you just mentioned, and I was remembering it because I think it perfectly captures, well, Jesus said it captures the gospel, and it is based on love. And I think it really does illustrate the meaning of love, because Jesus did say, as you just mentioned, first commandment, love God with all your heart and all your mind and all your soul. Second commandment, love your neighbor as you love yourself. And then he goes on to say, you do these two things, you got the rest of the commandments taken care of. And that, for me, in my interpretation and the way it comes across to me, is it's all based on love. Everything that has to do with God has to do with love, because he is the origin of love. He is love. And if you stay in that love and you love as he loves, you won't sin against your neighbor. You won't sin against your family. You won't sin against God, because you love him so much. For the same reason you wouldn't harm someone you love, you're not going to harm your neighbor. And you don't want to upset somebody that you love, you're not going to sin against God. So while love is, as we talked about earlier, is an emotion, it really is a tangible thing. It really is something that holds an incredible amount of power.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And, there's also this admission on Jesus's part that every human being is inherently selfish, right? And because love your neighbor as you love yourself, right? It's just assumed everyone loves themselves. And the whole point of this commandment, to love your neighbor as you love yourself, is to get out of yourself, right? To focus outwards to others. And loving your neighbor as yourself is sometimes very, very difficult. And I forget where exactly, and I think it is in Luke's gospel. It's in one of the synoptic gospels where Jesus is asked, how many times must I forgive my neighbor? Another admission, yeah, sometimes, your neighbor is not observing the golden rule. And how many times do you have to forgive? But then Jesus inserted this into the central prayer of the Christian religion. Forgive our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. It's a commandment, too, that you have to forgive. And in its most radical expression in the Sermon on the Mount, if you get slapped on one cheek, turn the other. Somebody wants to take your coat, give them everything else as well. It's a very radical commandment to love others. In the same way that, it's a radical commandment to love God. So it keeps being repeated throughout the New Testament too. In the Gospel of John, 15 verses 9 through 17, Jesus talks at length about how important love is. And he says, as the Father has loved me, to his apostles, so have I loved you. Now, he says, remain in my love. So for a loving relationship to exist between two beings, it has to go both ways, right? It's a two-way thing. And what Jesus is saying here, speaking as God, because the Father loves him, he loves them, and now remain in my love. It's a very, very real thing. His love is real. Paul in 1 Corinthians has an extended praise of love and how important love is, and includes passages that are probably read in 90% of Christian weddings nowadays, about love is patient, love is kind, love is this, love is that. But he also says in the same text, and I think this is a very important passage for mystics, which they focus on too, extensively, where Paul says, "For now we see only a reflection, as in a mirror." He's talking about God. "Then we shall see face to face." And the mirror analogy is not understood by many in our own day and age because we have such good mirrors. But in Paul's day, mirrors were just highly polished metal, bronze or perhaps silver, and you didn't see your face very clearly in any mirror. So seeing face to face, link this to the Psalm 42. When shall I behold the face of God? That's what Paul is talking about. And then he continues, now I know in part, then I shall know fully, even as I am fully known, which many interpreters have taken to also mean, now I love in part, then I shall love fully, even as I am fully loved. But that's an interpretation that's not exactly in the text. But then he continues, and now these three remain, faith, hope, and love. But the greatest of these is love. And that passage also quoted repeatedly by Christian mystics.
So let's talk a little bit about the Christian mystics and how God's love, this concept of love in the Bible, their own experience with love, how did it influence them?
Desire, of course, we've got to come back to that theme. Desire, you can't have love without desire. Love is about, sometimes it's about desiring another being. And in the case of human love that leads people to commit themselves to love each other for life, the longing, the desire is an essential part of it. And this is what is always at bottom, the foundation of Christian mysticism. Longing, desire, and a process. It's always a process that, you have to keep growing in love, growing closer to the object of your desire and your love. And, among early Christians, one of our first podcasts was on St. Augustine. And I think the title that we have for that episode is Augustine, the Prince of Mystics, because that's what Cuthbert Butler called him. That was actually the title taken from Butler's analysis of Augustine's mysticism. But this Prince of Mystics, for him, longing for God is such an essential part of human existence that he says early in his Confessions, and I'm quoting, "You have made us for," he's speaking to God, "you, God, have made us for yourself, and we are restless until we rest in you," which is the same thing as seeing face-to-face bit, because Augustine, as we discussed in that episode long ago, had been a Neoplatonist before he became a Christian. And for Neoplatonists, which was a philosophical school that had a very, very religious dimension to it, human existence, the goal of human existence was to return to the divine, because that's where we really belong. So Augustine actually describes very few of his mystical experiences, but he describes 3 in the Confessions, and 2 of them occurred before he was a Christian, and it was all about love, longing, reaching for the other, for the divine. In those 2 Neoplatonic experiences he says he was beaten back because he wasn't ready, and he was just too tied to himself, too tied to the world. But then he had the third experience he describes, he had jointly with his mother, shortly before she died. And it's all about reaching for the divine as an act of love, and also of longing to return, to have this experience and have it last longer, and eventually to have this experience last eternally. And that is the central theme of Augustine's mysticism, is constant desire to have this love for God last forever, and to feel God's love in return, right? So Augustine sets the tone for many Western mystics. You also find it in some of the Eastern Christian mystics in the Orthodox tradition. Of course, up to the 11th century, the two traditions, the Western and the Eastern, were one and the same. But this theme of love evolves very gradually during the first millennium. And of course, naturally, it evolves in monasticism, which is where you find the highest number of mystics writing about their mysticism. Most of them are monastics, and most of them dwell on the theme of how you get there and what you need to do to get to God, and what's the best way to love God. In monastic culture, best way to love God is to stop loving yourself and practice asceticism, practice self-denial. It's part of an essential commitment to focusing on something other than yourself. And within this monastic tradition, the key text, as I mentioned before, has been the Song of Songs. And love themes abound in monastic theology. It's impossible to escape it. But it's good to keep in mind that the monastic path to the divine involves not only not focusing on yourself, but that theme of the will and desire. Monasticism is all about training your will to make the right choices, and through those choices to come to love God. And no one expressed this, I think, in my mind, of all monastics, no one expressed this more clearly, and one might even say more scientifically, if you can turn love into a science of sorts, a monastic science, a Christian science. Bernard of Clairvaux, with his 4 degrees of love, which I think we discussed also in a previous episode, but at this point in this episode, it's important to repeat this, actually review what it was that Bernard had to say, because Bernard was a very good observer of human nature, same as Augustine. And of course, he read Augustine, he knew Augustine, and he knew his gospel texts. Bernard says that what we humans have as love that is inescapable, every single human, is love of self. And that, he says, is the first degree of love. And that is the lowest, and perhaps we can also say the shallowest level of love. So, following that commandment from Deuteronomy, also mentioned in Luke, is very difficult for most people. First step always has to be love your neighbor as yourself. Get out of yourself. Love your neighbor. Love God first, if you can, but also love your neighbor. So that first degree is one of selfishness. But Bernard said that, and he's speaking, of course, of monks, but also, at the very same time, of all human beings. Second level of love is that one comes to love God for selfish reasons. You start to love God for what you can get from God, right? In the same way that someone is very much taken to buttering up someone or giving them lots of compliments because you think you might be able to get something from them. Oh, that's a beautiful dress. Or, oh, what a lovely poem you wrote. You're such a good politician. Yes, give me something. So love of God for selfish reasons is the second level. Then, if one prays enough and one tries hard to make the right choices constantly, you get to the third level, which is that you start to get feedback for your prayers. You start to actually encounter God, and you realize how much God deserves to be loved. And you actually fall in love with God. That's the third level. And he says that's what monks are aiming for. That third level, he says he doesn't know how many get there, but that's a possibility, reaching that third level of love, which is that you love God for God's own sakes because he's so lovable. And you fall in love. It's like in human relationships, you fall in love with someone, right? As the line in a song by the Police from the early 80s puts it, everything you do is magic, right? Speaking of the other person. You just can't help loving this person. Everything they do is magic. This is the third level of love for God. You've got to love God because he's so wonderful. And you feel it You know it. You don't have to think about it. You know it. And again, let's remember, emotion enters in here. Desire, emotion. So then what could the fourth level be? It seems to, on surface, can you get any higher than loving God for God's sake? Bernard says yes. The fourth and highest degree of love, which he says can be experienced in this life, but only very fleetingly, and is actually reserved for eternity after death. But he says, yes, some people get to this fourth level. And the way I interpret Bernard, I think he's speaking from experience, that he has reached this fourth level, which is that you love yourself as God loves you, because you have been able to get a glimpse of the bottomless, fathomless love that God has for every human being, including yourself. So love of self as God loves the self is the highest degree of love, which, sort of takes the selfishness out of self. It's paradoxical, as are all the deepest mysteries in Christian mysticism. Very paradoxical. And then Bernard uses language, as I mentioned before in our previous show. He uses language that speaks of a merging of wills, the human will with the divine will. And here's an extended passage from Bernard. Review. I know we covered this before, but I think it's important to review it now. And I'm quoting, "As a drop of water poured into wine loses itself, takes the color and savor of the wine, or as a bar of iron heated red hot, becomes like fire itself, forgetting its own nature, or as the air radiant with the sun seems not so much to be lit as to be the light itself, so for those who are holy, all human affections melt away by some incredible mutation into the will of God." Human affections, I'll say it again, melt away by some incredible mutation into the will of God. "I believe," he continues, "that in this life we can never fully and perfectly obey the command to love the Lord your God with all your heart and soul and strength and mind." Yeah, he says, yes, in this life, never fully capable are we to perfectly obey that command. But we will for eternity. But how do you get there? Well, prayer and training your will to make the right choices.
I can see where Bernard is coming from here, that this is only really available, or will only really experience this love in eternity, and maybe a fleeting glimpse of it in this temporal life. I can see that because I believe that we won't be able to fully understand the love of God, won't be able to fully understand God, won't be able to fully understand eternity, and most importantly, we won't be able to understand our part in God's plan until we're together with Him. And a mystic who has that deep connection to God will maybe get a little glimpse of it, just as we've gone over so many other mystics that have been able to understand, for instance, the Trinity, but can't put it into words, or understand what heaven will be like, but can't put it into terms that we can understand, or hell or purgatory. This fourth degree, this fourth level of love really requires us to be able to understand God, which we really can in our mortal bodies.
Right. And not only that, what Bernard is speaking of is not just the perfection of the mind, but also perfection of the will. Because the more often that I read this passage to myself, the clearer this seems to become for me, that what he's speaking of here is the perfection of our being, the perfection of the human being, right? And the commandment is to love with what? All your heart, your soul, your mind, with all your being. That's what he's talking about, yeah.
Full sanctification.
Yes. Or as in the Eastern Christian mystical tradition, the term divinization is used more often than in the West. And this is what he's talking about, the divinization of the human self. And the metaphors that he uses, a drop of wine dropped into water, piece of iron turning red hot in the flame. Yeah, it's a metamorphosis. Mutation is the way that it's translated here in this passage. I can't remember what the Latin original is, but mutation, yes. A good mutation, the perfect mutation. So this theme of love, I mean, it's impossible to, I think for me, it would be impossible to come up with a complete list of every mystic that talks about love, because so many of them do. It's something you keep running into over and over again. But, Bernard is 12th century. And by the 14th century, returning to a text that we have another episode on, The Cloud of Unknowing. We don't know who wrote it. But if you want a how-to book, how to love God, this is the book. It gives you very practical pointers of how it is that you come to do this, how it's possible to do it. And its basic assumption is stated right at the beginning. It says that there are two ways of getting to God. It says we human beings have two powers. And this was written in English, Middle English. So there's no translating going on here. Humans have two powers to get to God. One is a knowing power, so our intellect, and the other is a loving power. And that loving power is superior. And it's the only power with which we can reach God. And the author of The Cloud, whoever he, or some people think she might have been, says that what we need to get to God is, and I'm quoting, a blind stirring of love. Stirring, right? A blind stirring of love. A verb to stir, right? You get that image in your mind of something being stirred up, a blind stirring. It's like you're bubbling over. And this is the quote. Try to understand this point. Rational creatures, such as men and angels, possess two principal faculties, a knowing power and a loving power. No one can fully comprehend the uncreated God with his knowledge, but each one, each being, in a different way, can grasp him fully through love. Truly, this is the unending miracle of love, that one loving person, through his love, can embrace God, whose being fills and transcends the entire creation. And this marvelous work of love goes on forever, for he whom we love is eternal. And there we go again, same thing as Bernard. This longing for God is also a longing for someone you can love forever. And this passage I was just reading ends with the following sentence. Whoever has the grace to appreciate the truth of what I am trying to say, let him take my words to heart, for to experience this love is the joy of eternal life, while to lose it is eternal torment. Wow. I think this is being expressed in terms that a human can understand, because when you lose someone you love, when someone dies, or when you lose the love of somebody you love, it can feel like hell. And of course, we're not talking about eternity. So, imagine upping the scale to eternity, to lose that joy. That joy, speaks of it as joy, is just devastating. The most devastating thing anyone can hope not to experience.
I have often heard hell described, obviously, in fire and brimstone and suffering and pain, but just as many times, in my case, I have heard hell described as a separation from God, a separation from God's love. And that is probably, or for me, it's as terrifying as fire and brimstone.
I agree with you. That's also extremely terrifying. And one Spanish writer, 17th century, Juan Eusebio Nierenberg, he had an Austrian last name because his parents were Austrian, but he grew up in Spain. But anyway, he said the worst thing about hell is that you will have eternity to regret every bad choice you made. Oh my God. In addition to having this separation from God, you're stuck bemoaning every bad choice you made without a psychiatrist or drugs to help you. Forget, you did wrong. But anyway, what is all this love talk about? I think it can come down, anyone can understand it if they have ever fallen in love with another person. They can understand what that feeling is. It's a feeling. It's an emotion. And if it's going well with this other person, yes, there's plenty of joy. It might not be constant joy, but there are certainly moments of joy. So marriage imagery, of course, comes natural to some mystics. And scholars who study mysticism speak of bridal mysticism, as in bride, right? Bridal mysticism is a common theme. And it's not exclusively reserved to female mystics, but it is more prevalent with women mystics, I think for obvious reasons, because it involves the male-female pairing. But male mystics can be bridal mystics too. But there have been some female Christian mystics who have actually experienced a wedding with Christ, a mystical marriage with Christ. And perhaps the best known are Catherine of Siena, and we spoke about this in our episode on Catherine of Siena. And the other is Teresa of Avila. And we spoke about this too when we covered Teresa. It's a full wedding that they experience. And in Catherine of Siena's case, King David from the Old Testament shows up with his harp to provide music for the ceremony. And Christ places a ring on her finger and says, "Now you are mine and I am all yours." And Teresa has a very, very similar, almost exact experience. And I know several experts on St. Teresa who say, yeah, it's quite obvious that she read Raymond of Capua's Life of Catherine of Siena, where this mystical marriage is mentioned. And this is why hers is so similar. But yeah, being married to Christ and having Christ put a ring on your finger, "I'm all yours, you're all mine," is divine equivalent to a human marriage. That I have only encountered with female mystics. But that's not to say, as I mentioned briefly before, that some male mystics can't be bridal mystics. And no one is more bridal than John of the Cross, right? Who was Teresa's confessor for a while and is also a Carmelite and close friend and associate of Teresa of Avila, though much younger than her. His poems, his love poems, can be read as secular love poems. And I've tried this with some of my classes. Give them the poem without telling them who wrote it. And I ask, is this person talking about another human being? And many students say, yeah, of course he is. Because the way he expresses it, and especially basing this poetry on the Song of Songs in the Bible, it's just spectacular. And I wish it were easier to translate poetry, but translating poetry, you always lose something. Because, for one thing, you lose the rhyming, if it's rhymed poetry, and the words. Sometimes if you translate the word exactly as it is in a dictionary, no, you lose the meaning of it. But let me read this in Spanish and then make an attempt at translating it to English, because in Spanish it's just devastatingly beautiful. As in the Song of Songs, he's talking about the object of his love not being there. He has been with his love before, but the person has gone away. In this case, the person is God. And he says this to the missing beloved: "Descubre tu presencia y máteme tu hermosura. Mira que la dolencia de amor no se cura, sino con la presencia y la figura." Wow. Reveal yourself is the first line. Descubre tu presencia. Be present for me. Reveal yourself. And slay me with your beauty. Look, the pain of love cannot be cured except with your presence and your figura, your very lovely, lovely beauty. Being there, being able to be seen, touched. So, I love that line, "Máteme tu hermosura." Yes, slay me with your beauty. That's why students say, no, this is written for about human love, not divine love. But I say, no, you're wrong. You're very wrong. And Teresa, even though she had a mystical marriage with Christ, our poetry and her prose texts don't carry the same kind of oomph as the passage I just read from John of the Cross. But she does say, and I'm quoting her, "Prayer is an act of love. Words are not needed. Even if sickness distracts from thoughts, all that is needed is the will to love. And she also speaks of prayer as an intimate sharing, or just a very intimate chat with the one you love. And, we could go on, but let's move a little closer to our own day. Is this stuff still happening? Did it continue to happen? And yes, the answer is yes, most definitely yes. And actually, a young Carmelite nun, same order as Teresa of Avila, with the same name. Actually, her religious name was after Teresa of Avila, Therese of Lisieux, the place name in France where she was from, Therese of Lisieux, also known as Therese of the Little Flower, a 19th century nun. One of her best known quotes is taken straight out of St. Teresa texts. And this quote is, "Our Lord does not so much look at the greatness of our actions, or even at their difficulty, as at the love with which we do them." So yeah, this goes on. And someone else that we did a podcast on, Sister Yvonne Aimé of Malestroit, her favorite prayer, Jesus, King of love, Roi d'amour, I trust in your infinite mercy. To me and to my mind, there's no more, and this is not just Catholics, okay? No, this love theme appears in Protestant piety too, and it's a beautiful hymn written by Charles Wesley. Love divine, all loves excelling. It's a beautiful hymn, absolutely beautiful. And, it's a Methodist hymn. Charles and John Wesley brothers were founders of what became the Methodist Church. Love divine, all loves excelling. Joy of heaven, the earth come down, is the first line. And it gets better from there.
I remember growing up in the 70s, which I believe was the time of the Jesus movement, I think from the 60s and the 70s. And you used to see bumper stickers, signs, and it was just 3 words, Jesus is love.
Mm-hmm.
And that movement was a Protestant movement, but Protestants also capture, as these Catholic mystics captured, the concept of God, Jesus being love, that it's all about love.
Right. And, in the Gospel of John, you have the expression, God so loved the world, he sent his only son. And then Jesus himself says, greatest love anyone can express is to lay down your life for your friends, for your loved ones. Speaking of his own sacrificial death. But yeah, you can't read mystical texts without running into the theme of love. And in some cases, such as the ones that, we've dwelt on during this hour, some of these expressions of love, descriptions of what it is and what it can be, they are so inspiring and very, very essential to keep in mind when things go wrong in one's life.
Well, we've always said mysticism is paradoxical, and kind of comparing this episode that we've had today with the episode from last month, you kind of see that paradox where love is everything, but there's pain and suffering there as well. But I trust that we will one day understand what it all means, and we'll be able to appreciate it, because I definitely do not believe it was a mistake. Pain and suffering is a mistake by God or something unintentional. Everything works together, as in Romans 8:28, my favorite Bible verse. Everything works together for the good for those who love God. And I can't wait for the day that I fully understand it. But this episode was very uplifting and gave me a better understanding of love and the role it plays in Christian mysticism. So who do we have for our next episode?
Well, Therese de Lisieux, we just briefly mentioned towards the end of this podcast. 19th century nun who lived a very, very brief life, but was very, very close to Teresa of Avila in her mysticism and what she made out of her mystical experiences, and became one of the most popular saints of the 20th century. So this is an important figure, much venerated, but sometimes not really read as much as her text used to be read. But we'll talk about that next time.
Sounds like another great episode, Carlos. Thank you for joining us today. And until the next time, thank you for listening to the Christian Mysticism Podcast. If you have any questions for Dr. Eyre, you'll find our email address in the show notes. Just send it over and we'll try to answer it in a future episode. And don't forget to click the subscribe button so you don't miss the next episode of the Christian Mysticism Podcast.